of decolonization that our post-colonial societies have been engaged in. And this is really what takes center stage in my talk today, which I've titled Unveiling and Undoing Colonialism's Linguistic Harm, the Law as a Site for Damage and Repair. As far as the insular Caribbean is concerned, the literature identifies some 50 language varieties spoken in the period just before European invasion in the islands that now constitute part of the independent Commonwealth Caribbean. And if we add the continental Commonwealth Caribbean to that, the Mayan languages of Belize at the time of European invasion, and the languages spoken by the main Amerindian peoples who the Dutch encountered in Guyana, it seems fair to say that there were at least 23 language varieties spoken at the start of European invasion in the territories now comprising the independent Commonwealth Caribbean. Now, of those 23, the 15 that I mentioned were spoken in the insular Caribbean are largely non-existent today. That has been attributed to slaughter of the Tainos and the island Caribs by the colonists, disease brought by the Europeans, as well as forced labor by the colonists, causing the near extinction of the Tainos as a demographic collective, and the rapid decline of island Caribs in the majority of territories which they had inhabited. And one language expert, James Crawford, he puts it this way: the one surefire way to murder a language is to murder its speakers. And language loss, or language death, in this case, via this means, genocide, from a sociolinguistic perspective is quite extraordinary. Because in commenting on language death, linguists have said that language extinction through genocide is rare, since instances of language death are typically the result of language shift. So the forced linguistic collapse and extinction by an arrest of the capability of linguistic groups to reproduce themselves and to transmit their languages intergenerationally, as occurred in the Caribbean, is not just egregious, but it is exceptional in its harm. But it's not just the fact of a linguistic demise per se that constitutes harm. Linguistic scholars have drawn attention to the results of language loss and extinction. There is the erasure of cultural identity and heritage that language holds. And that erasure, it has been argued, diminishes diversity and ecological stability, which are important to human existence. The UNESCO expert group on endangered languages has said that every time a language dies, we have less evidence for understanding patterns in the structure and function of human language, human prehistory, and the maintenance of the world's diverse ecosystems. We don't have enough time to really explore this now, but the link and correlates between biocultural diversity and linguistic diversity, and even an understanding of human cognition, has really become a focal point for study. And authors like Maffei and Harman and Mulhauser and Harrison, they have treated with that issue. So while the reparations narrative, I think, must highlight Caribbean indigenous language loss contingent on colonial genocidal activities, I submit that the reparatory purpose demands much more. It must also highlight and seek reparations for the wiping out, not just of the cultural identities involved, but also of the cultural knowledge base associated with this loss. That knowledge loss has implications for a deeper understanding of human cognition, arguably now unquantifiable within the Caribbean experience. So in the Caribbean, there's language loss or language damage on the one hand, but there has also been language gain out of slavery and the plantation societies of the Caribbean. The linguistic acculturation that came about with African-European contact in the socioeconomic context led to the development of the so-called Creole language varieties of the Caribbean via processes of pidginization and creolization, as some scholars theorize. And I just want to comment here that with the exception of Africans in South Africa, linguistic acculturation in the international jurisdictions we've been looking at seem not to have produced new languages, but we have here in the Caribbean situation the evolution. We had the evolution of many new vernaculars. The mere existence, of course, of these vernaculars may not perhaps be said to constitute linguistic harm or damage. Although one interpretation is that the new vernaculars reflected a masking of African culture and the superimposition of a European ethic, an attempt at African cultural erasure, arguably a colonial precondition for the new slave, non-human status that Africans were made to assume. But if creolization is perceived as an evolutionary process towards a respected dominant European language, in which the Creole is or remains something short of the lexifier, then the new vernaculars may not only be reflective of a measure of cultural assimilation, but they may also serve as a cultural differentiator. So the vernacular served a dual sociocultural purpose, assimilative yet differentiating. Both these roles of language are part of the colonial linguistic strategy. Various degrees of linguistic assimilation occurred, which were necessary, of course, for the effective functioning of slave plantation economies and society in the Caribbean. However, language also indexed the social division between the planter class and the enslaved. And that's a critical marker in these societies that were premised on slavery, a socioeconomic system that denied the very humanity of African enslaved people and their descendants. So, as part of the colonial linguistic strategy of differentiation, an ideology of inferiority of the new vernaculars was brought about and perpetuated, as occurred with the local varieties in the international jurisdictions that we have looked at. The ideology surrounding the new Caribbean vernaculars impoverished their linguistic status, reinforcing, if not helping to construct a sociology of English superiority and sophistication versus Black inferiority and barbarity. So linguistic differentiation is one dimension of the colonial strategy. But that differentiation should also be seen through the eyes, through the lens of the enslaved, the speakers of the emerging Caribbean vernaculars. And through this lens, one can also argue that the vernaculars reflect opposition by the enslaved to acculturation towards European norms. In his book, Roots of Jamaican Culture, Mervyn Elaine, who was an eminent Caribbean linguist, talks about maroon cultural resistance to assimilation to English, to the English norm, which he says included resistance to the adoption of an English language norm and the preservation of language codes incomprehensible to outsiders. And incidentally, the Maroons are Africans and descendants of Africans who ran away from the slave plantations and established their communities in the remote, typically the hilly areas of the island. So there was a distinction between the vernacular spoken by the non-Maroon population of Jamaica and an old form of the vernacular spoken by the Jamaican Maroons, which showed a large number of African-derived Coromantee terms that had been integrated into Maroon Creole. So similarly, linguistic differentiation in the inchoate linguistic assimilation exhibited in the vernacular languages of the African enslaved population and their descendants, that should also be viewed as resistance, as a kind of agentive response to colonial linguistic scarring and damage. So the new Caribbean language varieties constitutive of a degree of linguistic assimilation, yes, towards a European culture, may also be interpreted as acts of resistance, the linguistic consequence of an autogenic, purposeful response to the colonial imposition. And I think the reparations discourse should contend with this dimension of linguistic differentiation, a counter-strategy to the damage that was perpetuated by a colonial policy of degrading the linguistic heritage of the colonized. And I submit that the seeds of linguistic repair have thus long been sown in this counter-strategy of arresting linguistic acculturation and maintaining a measure of linguistic differentiation. And I'm not suggesting that this belies the harm of the albeit inchoate linguistic assimilation during the period of colonialism. As I've mentioned before, linguistic assimilation has eroded a critical self-identity feature and makes the assimilating group, according to the now late novelist, Kenyan novelist and scholar, Ngugi Waitongo, want to identify with that which is furthest removed from themselves with other people's languages rather than their own. The apparent tension in the signification of the linguistic differentiation is arguably tied to the traditional nature of the ideology surrounding the vernaculars of the Commonwealth Caribbean. Overt attitudes revere the target language and disparage the vernaculars. Covert attitudes, though, associate the vernaculars with positive values such as solidarity, friendship, and trust. It's a reflection, I think, of that assimilation resistance paradigm that I spoke about. The colonial language ideology, too, has affected and supported the typology of language use and practices in the colonial and post-colonial era. So conquest diglossia has been a feature of our Caribbean language situations in which a revered colonial language, the sole official language, is considered the only acceptable language variety for use in the high or the prestige domains, while the various local vernaculars considered second-class language varieties or linguistic deviants are relegated to the low or the less prestigious domains. This functional distribution of languages in the Commonwealth Caribbean typified the colonial period, of course, although the linguistic competence of the white ruling class at the time, and they were a demographic minority, meant that English was also generally the language of private informal communication within that group. The new Caribbean vernaculars had no place, though, within the formal domains. The enslaved and even freed people were effectively excluded from participation in public formal domains. Emanating from their status as things, as chattels, the enslaved were ineligible for public office and could not be tried by a jury of their peers in the law courts. The linguistic exclusion of vernaculars was also legally marked by the general rule that prohibited the admissibility of evidence of the enslaved against whites and free people in trials for much of the period of slavery. And with reference to Barbados, I will just mention Jerome Handler, his work, The Unappropriated People, which indicates that freed people too, people who had won their freedom during slavery, freed people too, despite their status in theory as free people, could not testify in courts nor sit in judgment, for they were debarred from magistracies, judgeships, jury duty, nor could freedmen participate in the legislative process as voters or office holders. So even in the post-emancipation period of colonial rule, the law was used as a tool to effectively restrict non-whites from participation in public domains. The result of this state of affairs is the general maintenance of the diglossic character of the sociolinguistic situation, in which the majority of the vernacular-speaking black population did not operate within the nerve centers of the public formal domains during the colonial era. The colonial apparatus thus functioned in English, the language of the colonizers, to the exclusion of the Caribbean vernaculars and their speakers. Now, in the post-colonial period, the quintessential nature of diglossia has persisted. This is so, although independence ushered in a new black political and professional elite who were bilingual or who are bilingual in their respective territorial vernaculars as well as in English. So English has remained the socially accepted language variety for use in the legislature, a social position which has some legal and regulatory support. So for example, under the constitutional instruments of 6 of the 12 independent territories of the Commonwealth Caribbean, competence in the English language is a qualification for appointment to the legislature. The language of Guyana's constitution is generally reflective of the constitutional requirement, and it goes like this. A person shall be qualified for election as a member of the National Assembly if and shall not be so qualified unless he or she is able to speak and to read the English language with a degree of proficiency sufficient to enable him or her to take part in the proceedings of the Assembly. And in any event, the majority of the independent Commonwealth territories implicitly make English an eligibility requirement for members of the legislature, because the rules governing procedures in the legislature prescribe that proceedings and debates of the legislature be in the English language. And at least in Jamaica, I can tell you that that rule has been expressly invoked by our Senate President to constrain the use of the vernacular, a vernacular expression that a senator in a session of Parliament, in the upper house of Parliament, he purported to use the vernacular, and he was stopped in his tracks by the Senate President. Legal support for the maintenance of conquest diglossia is also found in ordinary legislation. The statutory framework governing the selection of jurors, for example. So jury laws across the Commonwealth Caribbean typically provide that inability to speak, read, write, and understand the English language disqualifies a person from serving on a jury. I'll just read from the provision from the Antigua and Barbuda statute. It says, each of the following persons shall be disqualified from serving as a juror, and that list includes persons who cannot read and write the English language and understand the same when spoken. The corollary of this is that the official language of the courts is English, buttressing conquest diglossia, and I should point out that several of the statutes of the independent territories of the Commonwealth Caribbean governing juries, so our jury statutes, those tend to predate independence, and they therefore have their provenance in colonial legislation. And they're really just classic legacies, therefore, of the colonial project that perpetuate this historical exclusion practiced by the racialized judicial system, which the enslaved and free people experienced because they were Negroes and therefore excluded from that. But the coloniality of law in relation to language is not confined to currently enforced legislation with origins in the colonial period. There exist examples of modern, and by that I mean post-independence legislation, like our consumer protection statutes, which are supportive of conquest diglossia. I came across a 2016 news item from the website of the Caribbean Community, our Regional Economic Union, which heralded the change in the St. Kitts and Nevis consumer protection legislation to require that English be used on labels for goods, because as the news item said, the official language of St. Kitts and Nevis is English. And curiously perhaps, this was amidst concerns regarding foreign language labeling of goods being sold to the public in St. Kitts and Nevis. So insistence on English medium labels was perceived as part of the protective strategy for the average consumer. The fact that many of these consumers speak largely their local vernacular, and so are petition-dominant speakers, would tend to weaken that protection, I think. And of course, what it does implicitly is to reinforce conquest diglossia. So the laws, whether inherited or post-independence enactments, contribute to the maintenance of the structures and values associated with the colonial linguistic order, which has spawned linguistic damage in the form of discriminatory language practices and social exclusion. Historians have shown that resistance by the enslaved in one form or the other has been a constant feature of plantation life in the colonial Caribbean. I suggested earlier that linguistic differentiation between the speech of the enslaved population and that of the planter class might be viewed as an element of resistance, particularly in the context of the colonial pressure to acculturate linguistically towards English, and that linguistic differentiation constitutes seeds of linguistic repair. In the post-colonial period, with its legacies of colonialism and its own strain of social oppression, this period has also witnessed social resistance. I speak here about the socio-religious Rastafarian movement with its unique linguistic branding, and that's one form of the resistance I'm talking about. The movement's affirmation of the black man and its denunciation of what we call in Jamaica Babylon, which is really a reference to the inherited oppressive colonial order. And that's why, I don't know if some of you know the song that Bob Marley sings, "Come we go gun down Babylon one more time," right? So that's Babylon that he's talking about, an oppressive socio-political order. So the affirmation of the black man and the rejection of Babylon are reflected at the linguistic level in what has been termed dread talk, which is the talk of the Rastafarians. And dread talk is based on the Jamaican vernacular, but it has it is marked by an alteration in the pronominal system in which the form I and I is used instead of Jamaican pronouns, Jamaican Creole pronouns, we and me in their relevant syntactic categories. So of this pronominal system, Enos Edmonds, writing on Rastafarian ideological resistance, says that in contrast to the me of Jamaica, which serves to objectify speakers, the pronoun I and I is an affirmation of self as an active agent in the creation of one's own reality and identity. Dread talk implies a rejection of subservience to Babylon culture, including the English language and the attendant notion of proper speech, a concept which helps, of course, to perpetuate the colonial psychology of the inadequacy of our vernaculars and English language respectability and superiority. So Dread talk demonstrates and advocates for agency at the level of language for a reparatory purpose. And this, I think, is instructive for the model of linguistic repair that I wish to advance. So how do we undo the linguistic harm? Well, calls for reparation for chattel slavery during colonialism tend to be outward-looking. Reparatory justice is hinged on the need for action to be taken by the ex-colonizers, typically in the form of apologies and or some kind of compensation, whether in cash or in kind, debt cancellation, technology transfer, that kind of thing. These are just some of the things that the Caribbean Community's 10-point plan envisages as what reparations are. I submit that certainly when language is the object of repair, we also need to be inward-looking to exercise our own agency. This agentive response, I believe, honors and continues the tradition on the part of our Caribbean ancestors of differentiation, resistance, and self-assertion at the level of language that we've seen operating, despite the damage that has been wreaked by colonial attempts at linguistic acculturation and colonial language ideology of prejudice against Caribbean vernacular languages. I've alluded to this agentive response in the secret language of the Jamaican Maroons, the resistance by the enslaved and their descendants to complete linguistic assimilation, and of course, as I mentioned just now, dread talk in the modern era, all autogenic language-centered responses to colonialism and coloniality. And the appeal for self-repair to be included in the Caribbean reparations advocacy is actually intensifying. There seems to be a recognition that it is a necessary dimension of cultural reparations, of which language, of course, is an important part. One researcher on reparations, Dr. Claudette Anderson, whose work is about recasting the kind of negative and disapproving European perceptions of Obia, which is a kind of spiritual folk tradition in Jamaica, rooted in West African cultural practices. And Dr. Anderson puts the charge of self-repair this way when she asks, what do we owe ourselves? I submit that linguistic repair for colonial linguistic harm is part of what we owe ourselves. How then do we go about linguistic repair? My view is that the law, emanating as it does from us, from our various parliaments, should be deployed as a pathway to galvanize linguistic reparation. Legislation which aims to upend the colonial linguistic paradigm of vernacular stigmatization and inferiority, partly maintained by conquest like last year, should be enacted. One of the characteristics of law is its capacity to act as an agent of change to transform social practices. And this derives, of course, from its capacity to mandate, supported by its capacity to encourage and require compliance via enforcement provisions. But I think that the law assumes importance beyond this in efforts at linguistic reparatory justice. As I've shown in the discussion on the nature of colonial linguistic harm, the law and the judicial system have been key elements in inflicting, supporting, and maintaining that harm. And so the use of the law as a means of repair becomes important, not only as a symbolic act of denouncing the oppressive way in which the law has been historically deployed, but also as a subject matter itself in need of repair. A reparatory effort that should aim, as far as language is concerned, to infuse an ethos of affirmation of our vernaculars, which are a critical reflection, a critical component, if not an essential part of the construction and creation of our Caribbean civilization and identities. Repair of colonial linguistic harm by legislation has been undertaken to one degree or another in all of the international jurisdictions we've considered earlier in our discussion on colonial linguistic damage. New Zealand, the colonial discriminatory policy of the exclusion of the use of Maori language in courts, sanctioned and enforced by the New Zealand Court of Appeal in the case of Mihaka that I was mentioned, that was brought to an end with the promulgation of the Maori Language Act of 1987. That piece of legislation not only made the Maori language an official language of New Zealand, but also expressly provided for the right to speak Maori in legal proceedings. That marked the beginning step, really, in the process of change in attitudes towards and in the status and use of Maori in courts. Of course, New Zealand, we know, has a long way to go in terms of normalizing the use of Maori in New Zealand courts in general. But there is an increasing acceptance in New Zealand by the New Zealand judiciary of the use of Maori in legal proceedings. So, for instance, I read that there is now developed a practice in New Zealand of using Maori English bilingual introductions and endings in the courts of New Zealand. In India and in South Africa, as we know, there is not just legislative but constitutional recognition of indigenous languages. And that is significant, firstly because a constitution is a legal foundation of the state and tends to reflect the broad philosophical underpinnings of the state. But it's also significant legally because, of course, it's a supreme law. So laws that are inconsistent with the Constitution should yield to the Constitution. So the Constitution of India declares Hindi as the official language of the Union, even though this is effectively highly qualified by other provisions of the Constitution. Despite those qualifications, the Constitutional Declaration of Hindi as the official language of the Union of India reflects an ideological shift away from colonial rule, certainly in the minds of the leaders of India's independence movement. And this shift was expressed by Nehru, a leader of the movement who became India's first prime minister, as we know. And he's reported to have said this: "No nation can become great on the basis of a foreign language." Why? Because a foreign language can never be the language of the people, for you will have two strata or more: those who live in thought and action of a foreign language and those who live in another world. So we must do our work more and more in our language. A recognition there of the linguistic exclusion emanating from conquest diglossia in India, and a recognition too of the integral relationship between vernacular language use on the one hand and development on the other. And South Africa's modern constitution, as we know, we've been hearing from Zakira, took the bold step of being so inclusive in terms of declaring not just English and Afrikaans, but the other, the indigenous African languages as official. Also saying that the official languages must enjoy parity of esteem and must be treated equitably, and it also places a duty on the state to take practical measures to elevate the status and advance the use of the indigenous African languages conferred official status in the Constitution. Furthermore, South Africa's Constitution prescribes unfair discrimination directly or indirectly against anyone on various grounds, but including language. These provisions are designed to promote the historically oppressed indigenous African languages and must therefore be seen as part of efforts to repair the linguistic harm meted out during the colonial era, including the period of internal colonization during apartheid. So legislation, particularly in the form of constitutional instruments, have been deployed as a vehicle of repair for colonial linguistic harm. And I think this mode of repair should be squarely located in a self-repair framework and be advanced in the reparations discourse. This notion of linguistic repair by constitutions, I think, is particularly significant given the fact that constitutional instruments are the very medium via which our independence, the political collapse of the colonial regime, was ushered into being. I think then that the current constitutional reform efforts involving the Republican movement in the Caribbean, as we now have in Jamaica, following very closely on the heels of Barbados, which involves a further delinking and severing from, if not a rejection of the vestiges of colonialism in our state constitutional arrangement, that those reform efforts present the opportunity to and should engage with repair of colonial linguistic harm. So last lap, and I just want to use my last lap to address linguistic repair in the context of that Republican movement that that we're engaged in the Caribbean now. So the essence of republicanism, of course, is the abandonment of the reigning British monarch as head of state and the first citizen of our country, and installing one of our own in this preeminent position. But the notion of Caribbean republicanism encompasses a range of other values, including the assertion of identity, citizenship, decolonization, as well as democracy, equality, and justice. And it is part of the custom of republics to enshrine in their constitutions symbols of those values, as we've seen in the case of India and South Africa. The nexus between language and identity, which is linked to citizenship, makes the vernacular languages of the Commonwealth Caribbean, like Jamaican and Barbadian, or Bajan as they call it, ideal candidates for asserting and symbolizing the values of identity and citizenship. The concept of national identity incorporates, of course, notions of sameness as well as notions of difference. So you want to have intra-nation similarity, but you want to have distinctiveness, of course, from other nations. And our respective Caribbean vernaculars are well positioned to convey these values of identity and indeed citizenship, and to be an emblem of our collective sameness, and at the same time to distinguish us from any other nation. They are each a unique linguistic variety. Caribbean people all speak their respective vernaculars. Not all of us speak English. And Caribbean people have also begun to develop overt positive attitudes around speaking their respective Caribbean language, which signals solidarity and friendship. English doesn't carry that function out for us. Given the colonial injustices of not recognizing and not regarding the speech varieties of our ancestors as languages, and labeling them as barbaric and inferior and imperfect and relegating them to invisibility in the linguistic landscape, I think we owe it to ourselves to begin to repair this linguistic harm by constitutionally recognizing the languagehood of these vernaculars, by granting them status of national and or official language, and by promulgating an authoritative version of new republican constitutions inscribed in the respective vernacular. Jamaican in Jamaica, Bajan in Barbados, Creolese in Guyana, Creole in St. Lucia, and so on. By that constitutional act, we begin linguistic repair of the harm via our laws as a repositioning of our speech as worthy among languages, a language that is civilized, a language that is civilizing in its assertion that we exist as citizens, not subjects, in its creation and maintenance of a distinct Caribbean identity, in its resistance to Anglicization, and my point would be Anglophonization, and in its signaling of a rejection of Babylon values and the legacy of coloniality. The Republican values of democracy, equality, and justice demand substantive linguistic repair. They require social participation and inclusion, non-discrimination and fairness. And within the context, of course, of our Caribbean language situation, in which there's a significant mass of our population who are vernacular dominant speakers or monolingual speakers of the respective vernacular language, conquest diglossia is effectively exclusionary, indirectly discriminatory, and presents a challenge to even the most fundamental notions of fairness, particularly in criminal proceedings. All across the independent Commonwealth Caribbean, we have justice systems whose de facto official language policy is that proceedings are to be conducted in English. Our Chief Justice in Jamaica recently, he's on record as pointing out that the majority of litigants in the parish courts of Jamaica are patois speakers of the vernacular language in Jamaica. So this state of affairs raises questions not just of due process. You have to ask, well, are all accused persons understanding the procedures in which they're involved? That's one issue. But it raises as well questions of discrimination against court users who are vernacular dominant speakers. These speakers are, of course, obliged to speak their language when they interact with the justice system, but we have justice systems which are complicit in perpetuating the concealment and invisibility of Caribbean vernacular languages. And this invisibility occurs even when the vernacular language is patently different from the official language by virtue of its lexicon. So I'm referring here, for example, to French Creole speakers in official English St. Lucia. who suffer discrimination by this invisibility treatment, they're typically not afforded professional interpretation services as will be provided for a French speaker, right, in St. Lucian courts. So this linguistic discrimination in our justice systems, part of the continuing colonial linguistic harm in our Caribbean vernaculars and vernacular dominant speakers. These speakers are sidelined and are at risk of real prejudice, real disadvantage in legal settings. And I think that flies in the face of the Republican values of democracy as inclusion, equality, as non-discrimination, and ultimately then to the Republican value of justice as fairness. So our Republican constitutions should therefore initiate substantive linguistic repair by enshrining language as a factor upon which discrimination is prescribed. It is a step towards the repair of colonialism's linguistic harm inherent in the conquest diglossia, which is the language situation. I think this much is what we owe ourselves. And Kosi.
I wish to say, undoing the linguistic harm begins with I and I. Yeah. Thank you very much.